So, welcome to Ron and Nigel's weekly rant. Ron is a retired manufacturing engineer living in New Hampshire, USA, and Nigel is a retired engineering consultant living in Ontario, Canada. And we're going to discuss every time we get together what should the Western world do differently to be successful again, both economically and culturally. And this week, we're going to go through what is the issue with settling the USMCA trade deal. And we're going to look at it from the US point of view, the issues the USA has, what the Canada issues are, what Trump's position is, better understood, and also what our leadership in Canada is talking about, our Carney's position, and how do we think it will end? How do we're getting to the point now where things are happening, perhaps. So how do we see this thing unfolding and ending? And that's pretty much the overview. That's what we're going to talk about. So Ron, is this okay with you? And what's on your mind, on top of mind at this time, on these days on this topic? What's new to you?
Well, I thank you for having me on, and I'm looking at it from both sides of the border, like you are, more from the U.S. side, and I take it that you are looking at it from the Canadian side, and you have a better view of that. Um, and I fully expect that we can get through this and discover what the issues are together, and I look forward to that approach. So I'll leave it to you to give me some leading items, and then I'll follow through with my responses and help us through it from the U.S. end.
Do this. So okay, Ron, let's summarize what we agree on. Really globalization of trade in goods, the free movement of capital, people, religion, and culture has been pretty much a disaster for the Western world. There, there is a view in geopolitical circles that global free trade is a construct formed by some economists and special interest groups of mainly powerful global capitalists who are not operating in the best interests of nations and its citizens. And some global organizations, such as the UN and the WEF, are supporting this dangerous construct. So Trump is correct, and it's shared by many politicians, by the way, in the Western world, that he's correct to push back on globalization with trade tariffs. But his tactics leave a lot to be desired. We all accept that. And trade tariffs will also indirectly reshore both the products and most capital. It's one of those trade tariffs are a useful tool to reset the game. So Canada needs to join a new North American trade agreement, and it should be a North American trade bloc that eliminates most other duplicitous trade deals with others outside of North America. Now, external North American imports should only be on items we cannot reshore. You got to be religious. You got to take back everything other than what you can't reshore. Um, so within the North American trade bloc, both now and into the future. And it should become an option of last resort, not treat as a God-given right, which is what, unfortunately, we've got into. We now think that global trade is a God-given right for every nation to expect from another, and it's not. It's actually an anomaly in the way in which most nations have built their economies. And so external exports should be encouraged where we have excess capacity available across our North American trade bloc, where it's not a detriment to actually do that export trade, but it must not attract unplanned imports. There's no more of this trade gaming where we end up with a huge amount of imports that we can't manage within our economy just to allow us to export. So it needs to be a non it needs to be a non-combative kind of process where the exports are for the other person's benefit and also benefit us, but it doesn't attract a whole bunch of wasteful imports as well. Now, Carney's Canadian government is taking us in completely the wrong direction. That's the other thing we agreed on. And Carney is not the correct fit for the needed journey, as he's a green globalist and will not align well with where North America is heading. And that's really my summary. I think that's what we talked about, Ron. I think that's what we agreed to. So let's just have that closure. If you can just comment on what I've just said.
Yeah, I agree with what you've said, and apparently, uh, people have got the erroneous uh, 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 thinking that free markets are not beneficial to the average American or Canadian. And the reality is the free market economy is the best economy we can have to work with. And if we do it at a regional level, or as you suggest, as a North American trade bloc, that gives us strength and leverage over our ability to maintain our prosperity in North America. And that's the key. You know, we want to continue with the pros the growth that we've sustained over a period of time. I just read recently that the Jeff Bezos of the world and the other uh, so-called very wealthy or very wealthy people who've taken advantage of us through the free market economy, they've only realized 2% of the benefit that they provide to the rest of us, and 98% of it goes to the middle class and the lower classes, and increasing their wealth and prosperity. So we had a great benefit from the effort that we've seen from, say, the top largest seven uh, uh, businesses that are in the United States, and I'm sure that's the same as in Canada. So having a free market economy and working with that, making sure that there's no restrictions there that prevent them from being innovative and growing to improve and increase our wealth. That's a necessity for us in North America to accomplish.
Well, I think you're going to confuse people with that statement. What we
Okay.
have to do is define what we mean by free trade. Having free trade within a trade bloc is definitely go, but that not muddying it by going outside of the trade bloc with free trade as well, which is what we've done. We've ended up with both. We've ended up with mostly free trade, and not all that great between the three countries. Um, and that's benefited, free trade inside of a economic unit mostly is to be encouraged. If there is a disparity between areas, like then you need local uh, economic plans for each underdeveloped zone of your economy. But that's done by subsidies, not by um, shutting down trade. So I agree in principle, but I think you've got to qualify the word. Inside trade bloc, free trade is a go. Globalized free trade is not a go. And I think we have to differentiate. I think people get confused over what they mean by free trade. It's globalized free trade across national frontiers or borders that are a problem, not a trade bloc free market environment. And I think that needs to be differentiated in people's minds. So, Trump is not saying let's not have free trade. In fact, he's pushing Canada towards free trade by asking us to take down some of our barriers to free trade, say in the farming environment. But he's forcing other nations outside of that quote unquote North American environment to cut down their trade or pay for it with tariffs. Now, tariffs are a way of restricting trade. They don't block trade; they restrict it, and they make it an option of last resort. So yeah, if you've got something you can't buy inside or never will buy inside that trade block, maybe you shouldn't tariff it. Or if you do tariff it, it's part of your plan to pay more for that so that you induce yourself to maybe reshort later. And theoretically, a trade bloc is self-supporting. Um, the tariffs that you gain, you can put back into your economy to foster the growth of the industries that you want to reshore. or you can uh, use it to pay off people that are inconvenienced by the tariff in terms of price hikes. So theoretically, trade trade a trade tariff is free if you do it right, and it just induces reshoring and a better control of the internal free trade that you construct within the trade bloc. So I just want to clear that up, Ron.
Okay, no, and it's a good clarification. I agree with that.
Right.
Um,
But it's not
I
well understood. I mean, this is
yeah,
the average media guy doesn't get it right. They talk about
yeah.
free trade, and they mix the two up, and of course that confuses the hell out of everybody. So I just wanted to clear that up. Sorry to push back on
No,
that.
no, that's quite all right.
And I think the other environments. I did a paper on that, and I described what I perceived to be the natural trade blocks around the world. Um, and there's North America, there's Europe, there's Asia. There's a few outliers that don't fit.
Oh, yeah,
But, I mean, what you're really saying to, say, three countries in North America is, look, get your act together collectively so that you have a true trade bloc. Don't make duplicitous trade as a plan. It's going to happen, and it's a journey, and the journey will be messy, but you want to end up in the right place. And we don't even have a plan to get to the right place. Never mind in the right place. But
right.
that's kind of where we are. I think that um, a, the issue is that some countries want their cake and eat it. They want a trade bloc. They want access to each other's markets, and they still want to trade all over the world, which it doesn't
Right,
work.
right,
And that's exactly where Carney's two-faced. I mean, he's already said, we want to trade with the U.S., but we also want to trade with everybody else. That's old thinking. That's what we did for the last 30 years, and it's not worked. And so we have to really realize that let's take the other trade bloc environment, which is the EU. They had it, they had it almost ready, gunned up to do right, and they did it wrong. They put all these countries together with a common currency, at the time fairly strong borders, which they changed, and they had the opportunity to stay within their own trade bloc with their trade, with their activities, and they didn't. They allowed China in, Korea, all these other countries to share in their trade bloc environment, and it's made them very poor. And
I
so I
I'm
think I think that the European Union is a better example, a bad example of how bad you can get with a trade bloc that you could have had, right?
Yeah, and they lost their opportunity to create a strong trade bloc. They didn't recognize how important that was,
Right.
and of course they're so energy dependent. After they reduced a lot of their nuclear power creation and use, like Germany just closed them all the nuclear power down, and that's not a good way to maintain your internal approach to creating energy and propelling your businesses to success. Um,
But
I
it's self-inflicted. They have the
yeah,
energy. They haven't developed it. I mean,
right,
they went with cheap Russian gas, and then thought that was going to work, and then they didn't bother with nuclear because they were scared of it because of Merkel mainly decided it was a risk after a few people died from um, the the issues in Japan, and in Chernobyl. But the facts of the matter are, if they proceeded properly with the nuclear programs they had in the 70s in Britain, in France, and in the time in Germany, and proceeded, they wouldn't even need to worry about other forces of energy.
right.
The rest of it could be so they blew it. They blew a plan that they could have enacted very well, and now they're on the wrong side of the coin. And that's exactly the message: is that it can be done, but you can screw it up real easy by not following the right policies. And so Trump's online doing the right things, not getting support from the rest of the world because they don't understand the implications. They're thinking too short term, not long term. But he hasn't helped the case any by his, very, very inept kind of execution. But if you'd been a slick executor of this idea, we would have been a far better off. Um, and maybe the EU will come to the party eventually, but they are so messed up politically right now, it's very hard to see.
Yeah.
Um, so, but that's just a way of understanding. So there you have two potential trade blocks, the North American trade bloc and the European trade bloc, and both aren't executing very well.
Right.
One's executed very badly, and the other one seems to have trouble executing a restart, which is the case with Trump and Canada and Mexico.
Yeah. Well, I think a big impediment is this concept of the creeping socialism that's happening in both the Canada and the United States, and the concept that you can socialize the economy by having the government become more of a catalyst to creating the wealth in the economy, and that's what Carney is selling, and it's going to be a failure because you have to get the economy to grow on its own with a market that is stimulated by innovation and growth for products and services that the public wants and needs. And I think that's been undermined by the Liberal government in Canada over the past 15 years. What's your thoughts about that?
Oh, I think it goes back to what I said earlier about the real I called it the construct of globalization. Um, when you've got powerful global organizations such as the UN and WEF spouting the religion of free trade globally, um, to support these guys that are part of the construct, it's very difficult for people to understand the danger. Okay, so I don't think a lot of people are on board with what we're doing here enough. Unfortunately, it still needs a sales job, which Trump's not doing. Um, and he's a leader. There aren't that many um, politicians they'll follow him because they have no choice, rather than they're following him because they agree with him. I think that's an issue. In fact, the biggest fear is that he gets whacked at the midterms and we don't get any of this done. Um, it's so in other words,
Yeah,
the new direction is very fragile. We must realize that for two reasons. It's easy just to let happen what's already happening. That's the political way, unfortunately, rather than do a reset. Very few politicians like Trump are prepared to, you know, do a reset in front of their voters. Okay. Now, Trump ran on the right ticket. He made it very clear. He's one of the few politicians that's done after he was elected what he said he'd do. Most of them don't do that. They say a whole bunch of good stuff and then they don't do any of it after they're elected. So his integrity in terms of his policies is great, but his detailed tactics are poor. Okay. So his policies, his his um, intent, both politically, is correct, but his execution of those policies needs a lot of work. And unfortunately, that's what's confusing people. And they're looking at the noise rather than the signal, if you will, in terms of what he's trying to do. Um, and you've got enemies, if you will, in terms of the concept, in terms of the construct, which is the UN and WEF. They're
right.
pushing, and of course, politicians like to be aligned with these two guys, right? So you've got, oh well, we all want, and the more you're socialist, it's really weird. You would think if you were a socialist, you'd be more nationalistic, but you don't. When you become a socialist mentality, you think globally. It's crazy.
Right.
So, so what we got is we need to get back to a true nationalistic mentality. Okay, and what we've got is neither. We've got right wing guys that used to be neo neo globalists, and we had socialists that we used to think like unions. Okay, they now think like globalists. So we've got a
Right.
real dichotomy of leaning of the various political parties. We don't have, it used to be that a Labour Party in the UK, where I grew up, was for the people, because it supported the unions, and it was done by, the government had to cope with the unions, and the way to do it was be part of the union, which was the Labour Party. That was definitely a nationalistic opinion or nationalistic approach to, the politics. Not anymore. Not anymore. So what we've lost is that nationalistic. I'd say the biggest issue is we've forgotten that we're part of a nation. That's the biggest issue we have. Not that you can't group up as nations and become a trade bloc, but you can only do that if you think like a nation in the first place. And we don't.
Right.
And that's actually the biggest issue.
So we should think in terms of us being North Americans and
Correct. Correct.
as part North Americans, and that we think alike on our approach to how we run our economies together and in a cooperative manner to reduce any of the constructs we have now that prevent us from going between countries, namely our uh, again, we have to talk about immigration. We have to talk about commerce going across borders. We have to talk about uh, uh, fentanyl, drugs being produced in some of the countries that are being shipped overseas without any restrictions. I mean, these are things that we have to deal with as a North American trade
Yeah,
bloc.
it's even bigger is that we're not operating as a trade bloc. I mean,
Right,
we're operating as three countries that have a joint agreement on trade, which is not watertight. It allows take Mexico. They made it a decision to actually start trading with other nations rather than focus on the U.S. On the USMCA, or even NAFTA, for that matter. And so, they've got themselves in real trouble with a dichotomy of trade activities with, say, China, that's going to hurt them. They're going to have to stop doing things so they can comply with the new USMCA trade bloc culture. And so, yeah, it's not a slam dunk. There's a lot of retraction of existing policies required across all three countries, actually, before you're going to have a true trade bloc. And that's, even Trump is confusing on that because he suddenly says, "Well, we will trade with China or we will trade with somebody else." It's a difficult road to follow, and what you need is a very clear vision of where you want to end up, even if you have to break your own rules to get there, right? So this is why it needs to be very well communicated across the three countries or in any trade bloc culture of nations. And I think that that's what I'm poking at is that if you think like a nation, you're halfway there. And then you got to decide who else you're dealing with in the trade bloc and then all think the same way and make sure you try to follow all the rules you've set up. We're not even trying to do that. So I'd like to
well,
move. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, well, the reason he's still working with China and dealing with China is because we're dependent on
It,
materials from them, the
right.
rare earth materials that we haven't
It's a game.
exploited. Yeah, and Canada has a majority of the rare earths that we need, and also the United States does. I don't know about Mexico; they probably do too. We haven't exploited our resources create to get rid of that dependency, and that's
Well,
why
I mean,
we're
there's no grand plan. And I mean, that's my point is that
yeah,
if you sit down and say, guys, we're going to have to work with China for the next 5 years, but
mhm,
surreptitiously we're going to extract ourselves from that, that would be an acceptable. That's my point. That's a
yes,
tactical move to get through to make the change happen. But that's not clear. Not it's not clear to everybody that's what we're doing, and B, I'm not even sure it's being done anyway.
right,
So it's been badly executed, if you will. But nobody even has a vision of how it's going to end up. That's the other point. Um,
right.
you get close with um, if you sat down and looked at the asks from the U.S. they've got the clearest vision, in my opinion, between the three countries. If you look at the ask from the U.S. Negotiators, that's closest to where you're going to end up. But the asks don't get fulfilled by the other countries for whatever reason, and even the U.S. doesn't follow its ask. You know what I mean? Doesn't follow what it thinks it should do,
Right.
and you've got corporations that have lost the plot in terms of nationalism, that need to be brought home as well. And so, you got capital that's being put into the rest of the global environment that needs to come back. That takes time, and it
Yes.
takes a lot of commitment to do that. And that's exactly why, if you look at, we're undercapitalized, right, in Canada, and it's our own fault in most cases. But I'd say the whole of North America will be undercapitalized in a way because the corporations have moved it elsewhere, and it has
Right.
to be rebuilt and regrown and reconstituted. So there's a lot of economics here, that global economics, if you will, that needs to take place. You can only do that if you have a clear vision of where you want to end up. And I don't not like the idea of it being a 4-year window where Trump loses the midterm and gets denatured and gets pushed out, and we don't follow the thought in the next 4 years, which is what exactly's happened. The other guy that came in after Trump went in completely the other direction.
Right.
And so, that's the other issue, is our politics are not well aligned. In fact, I would say one of our biggest issues is that we have a democracy. And
Yeah.
it's not a very democratic process that you want to follow. I'd say China's an advantage is they have one government. It's in control all the time. We are disadvantaged by politics because of democracy.
But
And
that can happen if we get our leaders to set policies that are pro Canadian, pro US, pro Mexico in a trade bloc. And so a democracy can work if we get our leaders to recognize the need to be cooperative within our element. Right now, we have three big obstacles we have to overcome, and one is the fact that our cities have been captured by outsiders. You have the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, who have their agendas 21 and 30 embedded into our larger cities, their organizations, both in Canada and the United States. So they've done that without the approval of our national governments,
I said that
right?
already. I told you already
I,
that
I,
this is
I,
the enemy. Those are the guys that
but I'm
have,
just talking about how they're embedded, right?
yeah.
And somehow we have to root that out. The other one is the intergovernmental panel for climate change, and how that's been embedded in our cities and our culture and so forth, and our thought and approach. And we have to get that corrected, because it's leading us in the wrong direction, and maintaining the efficiencies we've achieved with our environment. We've reduced pollution in our environment, and we did that by exporting it to foreign countries to create cheap products back to us, and that that has to be fixed. We have to stop thinking in terms of correcting the world environment based on the IG uh, intergovernmental panel approach, and think in terms of how we integrate our economy around what's best for us in our trade bloc.
I said it already. I said
No,
that we've
no,
got
I
to
know,
start.
I know,
We got to
I know you
start
have.
thinking nations, not, I mean, this is a global centered thinking.
Right,
This is the UN and the WAF. I've already said they are following the agenda of the
right.
globalists.
But I'm
Okay.
just talking about how embedded that is, which,
Absolutely. I mean,
and
unfortunately,
we have to get that squared away. Our leaders got to recognize that. They don't understand that.
I just said
That's
that
my
too.
point.
Unfortunately, we've lost the plot as far as nationalism is concerned.
right,
right? And you can't go to a trade bloc until you got strong nationalism,
right,
right? And that's so we've allowed globalism, which is almost a cultural issue, into our environment. We've lost the national environment that we used to have. That
right,
would never have happened uh, when I was young, right?
right,
Post-war, yeah, we had to help each other because there were devastation after World War II, but the nations told themselves as nations, you
right,
know, and that's lost, and that's the first thing. So you've got cities, mayors of areas that do their own thing. They don't even follow the rules of the federal policies, right?
or
Uh,
provincial,
or provincial. So,
right,
it's free. That's my point. Democracy is not working. This is part of the way in which your government's supposed to integrate. And democracy, both horizontally and vertically, are not working. And they're not,
right.
and probably not, and
and
you've,
and it can work, and it can work.
well,
United States, no, at least it can work. For 30 years, it's the end of the 19th century. The United States had the strongest growth economy in the world, had zero inflation, and the markets had free reign and no interference or from the government. We didn't even have a central bank in the United States, which right now the central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve, is an impediment to our markets in the United States. It needs to be. We need to think about whether we want to have a central bank, and allow the small and medium-sized banks to have more control over their regional economies than what's happening now. Right now, the larger banks are working very hard to absorb medium-sized banks around the country in the United States, which is going to create less opportunity for a free market to work in our not a free market, but uh, a, uh, a market to work where it benefits the individual much better than it is right now. And that can happen if they follow what happened at the end of as a democracy at the end of the 19th century.
I don't know. Banking, if you look at Canada and the US and compare the banking systems, there's pros and cons on both sides. Okay. Um, and I think that is an open subject. I wouldn't like to comment. I think, the banks are regulated and there's not many of them in Canada. And how does that work for you versus the open season that you've had in the US? So, it depends. It depends on the subject matter and depends on the issue as to which is better. Um, Certainly we need more national control of the banks, because there's one currency. I mean, one of the things that we have is a currency control mechanism with banks that, through interest rates. I mean, interest rates, currency, they're all related, and so this is the other issue, Ron, is that you don't have a national stock market. You have an international stock market. And you can even trade your goddamn currencies around the world, which is
Right,
the point I'm making about capital transfer.
right.
So that's got to stop, okay? And that's pretty recent. That was in the late 70s, early 80s that took place. And you go back to the halcyon days of the 50s and 60s, you couldn't move capital like you can today.
Yeah, but earlier in this century, we had many more state banks.
I don't think that's the point. I mean, I think it's a
Let me finish. Let me finish. You're interrupting. North Dakota has had a state bank for 100 years. It has never had a recession. Ever had a recession. It didn't go through a depression.
fine. I agree. I mean, I
And
don't.
the reason is they had control over their local economies. And when things slowed down, they created money and they sent it into their agricultural area of the economy, which is their largest economy, and kept that operating so that people had the food they need and so forth, and the work and labor. And they upgraded all their farming techniques at the same time. So when they came out of when the rest of the country came out of the recession, they were prepared to sell more to to the United to the other states in the U.S. Now, that's important that that there's less control from a national bank over the economy in the states, and the states have to take more control over local regional economies to help to create prosperity and for their particular needs and resources that they have to work with, and that's going to be ferreted out. That's a policy change that needs to happen in the United States and in Canada.
I don't know. I think that's, a good point you're making. I think it needs to be worked out. I think what the bigger issue for me, I agree, if you can find a better way to structure banks so that they take care of local needs, that's great. I mean, I think some banks do that, but even though they're centralized. But I agree that, that there's going to be a requirement for subsidies, if you want to call it that, or bank local investment. I agree, but I think that can be covered nationally too. So you can argue about it's more a question of control than functionality. The biggest issue for me with the banking system is not the system itself, but the way in which you manage capital. And I think the first thing you have to do is stop letting capital out of the nation. And that's stop the free movement of capital between nations. And by the way, the barn door's been open and the horse is already bolted in most cases. But it's an issue that needs to be looked at in terms of how capital moves. Maybe the capital can move within a trade bloc, but not outside it. That kind of stuff. So I mean, that's an issue we have to come up with, have to control, because that's, if you use the argument that the people that are moving the capital don't own the capital; they just have access to it, which is the industrialists, the corporate, the corporate guys I mentioned earlier, the globalists have control of capital. Do they really own the capital? In other words, if money's made, how much of it was owned by the country, providing the environment for that capital to be made? And that's how we used to think. The country made the capital, and the
Right.
capitalists had access to it.
Yeah.
Some degree of percentage between the two. We've allowed that to become 100% mobile and owned by the capitalist, who
Right.
really were renting it in some respects. So that's the issue that needs to be solved, the
Right. And that's
capitalization.
that's because the largest corporations have become transnational. Another
Absolutely.
concept, right? And
Right. Well,
that's
that's what I'm talking about.
we've got to fix that, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm poking
Yeah.
at. Is the reason they've allowed themselves or allowed they've been allowed to become transnational is the movement of capital.
Right.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have been transnational.
Right.
Okay.
Now the United States and Canada right now are completely opposite in capital movement. Trump
Mm,
is prospecting and getting. He's got some 18. So he claims $18 trillion of capital coming back to the United States to create businesses in this industry and in the United States, which is a form of repatriation that you're talking about.
yeah, but that's been driven by as a transient movement due to his policies. But that's still not the right policy. He's not put the control in place on capital. He's benefiting from the free movement of capital in the right direction.
Right.
But what I'm saying is once it's back, he has to put some controls in place so it doesn't disappear again for some
Okay,
other
that's a
reason.
that's a very salient point
Right.
you
That's
made
my
there.
point. That's my
Yep.
point. So,
Yep.
it may maybe make sense to do this later once it's all back. But my point is that's the issue that we've been facing is the free movement of capital. It's empowered the globalization of these guys. It's allowed the empowerment of globalization.
Right.
Okay. So, and the good news is your point is that tariffs bring it back anyway,
Right.
right? But you got to keep it back, and that's the
Right.
point. So, Ron, I thought you raised some good points there about banking and so on. Um, they're part of the story of making sure we're national thinking. I want to cover, I want to move on and talk about how we would solve this. Well, you've covered some of the solutions, by the way.
Yeah.
So I covered a lot of the
Can, can
straight.
can I can I just before we get into that, I just want to make one quick point. Um, and because I think you're going to talk about this later, but Uh, Trump, in I think it was um, March of 2025, he declared the Mexican cartel as a terrorist group, and then the approach he took, he did that because he's concerned about illegal immigration coming across the border and how to shut that down. That was part of his plan. And of course, the cartel right away tried to do the end around flying planes into the United States and also boats coming into the United States. Of course, he was right out there destroying the boats if they didn't stop for boarding. And the planes they would greet them on the ground and stop them when they landed in the United States using their latest radar technique. Tech, uh,
What's your point, Ron? Get your point, bud.
okay, but he stopped the immigration coming across the border. That
I
was
agree. I mean, that's part
right,
of nationalism. A border is
right.
too porous. Got
But
that.
we don't have that in Canada, and
What do you
I
mean we
thought
don't have
I'd
that?
ask. We
What do you mean?
we we have porous borders in Canada. People who are illegals that came into the United States have migrated across the border in Canada. And
Well,
I
no, I
wanted
think
to ask,
no, I don't think it works that way. I think, yes,
okay,
of course, the border is a long border, and there will be people moving from one. I mean, most of it's from the U.S. into Canada right now. Um, But I think our problem is slightly different. I think most of our problem is that people come here on a visitor's visa or a student visa, and then they declare refugee status. That's our biggest
okay,
problem. I
all
mean,
right,
that's not the same as a wetback, coming across on the southern border of the U.S. and suddenly finding a job on a plantation down there, on a farm down there.
right,
That's a different kind of immigration, or a
yeah,
different kind of uh, illegal immigration issue. So we've actually we have cited them, all right. Maybe there's some people coming in on visas that are student visas, staying and not declaring themselves. They're hiding from themselves, hiding from the authorities. But we have people blatantly staying in the country under a refugee status for years and
yeah,
working here, and students working here. That's our biggest problem. So, and then we have legal temporary workers that also make that worse as well. So I think it's a different kind of immigration issue. It's an issue. We both
right,
have unplanned immigration, and we all know that we need to get back to something that's a lot more controlled and more economically benefiting to the nation. Not what we've become is a a um, a socialist entity. Oh my God, the poor guys, let
right,
them in because they can have a better life. Well, I'm sorry, we got people living in bloody tents,
right,
and our half our a high percentage of youth unemployment. So how does this work?
right.
So
And
I think people are grabbing that pretty well. I think that's happening, and that's getting, people a little bit more nationalistic in their thinking or citizen mentality. But it's taking a couple of decades for that to work its way through. So, so if the government, I would say, if you mark the government's card right now on immigration, most people will say it's not enough control. They've cut back, but not enough. So it's got to be regimented. In fact, I would say that um, we need immigration to be zero. Covered a lot of this trade block subject with articles and videos on my Substack. I've documented my position on the trade block environment.
yeah,
Okay, so let me talk about how I see a new North American trade bloc being undertaken, because we
okay,
we now need to talk about how we would do it. We agree it needs to be done, um, and really it's about how the USA, Canada, and Mexico get this done, and how we're going to actually do that. Um, and that's what we say we do next. And the new government that can work with Trump in Canada is not the right government. That's the first thing. So we all need better governments. And what I mean by that is that Trump is not representative of the typical government of either the U.S. or Canada. He isn't. I mean, he's an outlier. Um, he's not a politician. I mean, he talks about the administration being broken, the deep state and all that good stuff, right? So there needs to be some changes to government, in my opinion, to get this done. So first of all, the political machine in Canada will need to change. We don't have. You could argue that the U.S. is bad too, but certainly, I'll just speak for Canada. Our political machine, it needs to change. It's not working at all well. Okay. Um, and it's the old British system, and we're not even using that properly. We got
Right.
people moving across the bloody aisle after they've been voted in one
Yep.
particular policy. That doesn't work. Okay.
Right.
We got a parliament with a goddamn provincial government getting a vote, which is Quebec. That doesn't work, in my
Right.
opinion. So the other thing that doesn't work is we don't have our citizens voting. So we got to make the voting mandatory, like Australia, with penalties. If you don't vote, you get whacked on your taxes. Very easy to do. Okay. Um, and also, I'd install a qualification test so you're viable to vote. And if you got dementia, or you're not educated, why should you vote? You don't. There's a responsibility as well as a right to be a citizen. And I don't think we've got that well organized.
You have to prove your capability to vote. That's
Yeah.
what you're
I
saying.
mean, it's
Yeah.
I mean, it can be. Are you reading? Are you up on the situation? Do you know what you're voting for? In a nutshell. Um, and if you don't vote, you're not a citizen, and therefore you should be charged accordingly. That's the kind of stuff that I think makes people sit up and pay attention. And therefore our children need to be educated better. It forces education organizations to focus on the capability to vote, not just you know feed them propaganda.
Right.
Um, then we got to reduce the size and the layers of government.
Yes.
Okay, and that goes hand in hand with all of what I just said. Okay, then we need to discuss the notion of integrating how we would integrate Canada into the US and much more, which while Trump had his mind on the subject of the 51st state, we should have gone down there and said, what exactly do you mean by the 51st state? Maybe it's a bad term to use, but what would it look like? What would it actually, and there's books written on the subject. I mean, there's books out there. Other experts have tried to construct a North America before,
Right.
so we should go back over that information and understand how that integration might take place. And it might be Mexico as well, because they've got a, part of it. And take that message as a positive agreement and get it through with Trump. Even if it takes 10 years to do, it's the right thing to do. And we're instead of putting our elbows up and trying to keep business as usual, we should be looking at the future and at least discussing the options, and they're not being discussed. Don't talk about it. It's too holy to talk about, right? That's been the
Yeah.
position, and that's
Yeah.
wrong. That's wrong. Um, and we should then be able to focus on Canadian strengths, whatever they may be, energy, minerals, food, whatever. And Trump's statement is he doesn't need Canada. Well, he's wrong. We know he's wrong, but that's his position. But if we go down there and say, look, we don't have a fight over this, but let's really discuss what we might be useful for and get that integrated into the discussion, that's necessary. It's not even happening. It's
Yeah.
negotiation tactics, not integration tactics. If you go down there negotiating, you don't talk about this stuff. You don't.
Right.
Okay. Um, Now, if we did this, what I perceive would happen would be more of a north-south thing. We'd integrate some of the provinces north-south. The small guys up north would be integrated with the bigger guys on the border. So you've got a vertical series of provinces that would end up becoming states. Okay, they're big enough to become states. Um, and by the way, Quebec would have to be a state, nothing more. None of this nonsense that we put up with, okay? They'd just be a state like anybody else. And they're going to have to reset themselves into that mode. And they're going to have to realize that different language may be expensive for them, because I'm not paying for dual labeling my products anymore. So,
Interesting.
I mean, yeah, if you want
I was picturing Quebec as an island surrounded by a sea of prosperity. It could possibly happen if they decide to hang on to be their nationalism,
right,
internal
it's
nationalism.
yeah,
You
it's not nationalism, it's parochialism.
hmm
Um, and they got to get over it. They got to get over the fact they lost the fucking war. Okay, please get over it.
Yeah,
I got to. Okay. Um, and then we need then we can start looking at central defense systems. I mean,
yeah,
when I mean central, I mean North American wide defense systems. No, the border control will not be north south of the U.S. Canadian border, and
right.
eventually not south, south of the Mexican border. It's going to be the border lines. It's going to be the tidal support, making
The
sure people
the periphery of all three countries.
correct.
Yep,
There'll be two levels. There'll be an external level, and there'll be some internal controls, but they'll be
right.
different, right? That's
Yeah,
my point.
yeah,
Um, Now, the big one, all policies, and you mentioned this earlier, and I can cover it. We got to make sure all policies, both external and internal, are completely aligned, right?
yep,
And I'm talking policies. If you want to administer them slightly differently, fine. But even then, they're going to be known. So, in other words, if a state decides to do something different, it's got the approval to do it differently with the other states, right?
yep,
It's not a
yep.
state-driven decision. It's it needs to be concurred with so that they
Right.
can. Well, we're way further north. It's colder here. We got less population. We're going to do things a little differently, but it doesn't undermine the general national policies. So that needs to be done. Same with trade. You know, Trade needs to be a North American wide discussion, not
Right.
local.
Yep.
So that's the external and internal policies thing. Integrate all the laws, standards, and protocols across the three countries.
Oh yeah.
Uh, we got health care and you got guns, that nonsense. Well, I don't care about that. There's other stuff. If you kill somebody, here's what happens to you, right? The
Right.
judges need to be aligned, right?
Right.
I mean, I take all the judges away and start using AI for law. Was it right? I mean, it's a logical um, system. Why can't you just say, well, you broke the law. It's been proven you broke the law. Maybe the law courts have to prove it, but the outcome is always going to be the same. I don't care what your nationality is. If you're an immigrant, you're not getting a different deal, which is what's happening today, than a citizen. Okay,
So you can remove the bias using
correct. We need
AI, right?
we need to remove the bias of these limp-wristed friggin' judges. Okay,
Yeah.
that's got to happen.
Hmm.
So we end up moving by virtue of all that. We start moving and returning, probably returning toward a common culture.
You're talking about efficiency improvement by
Well, yes,
through integration of
yeah, uh,
our standards. There's
right.
nothing wrong with that.
No,
I
I
mean,
mean,
I look at we have the uniform business code down here. Why can't it be a uniform North American business code, right? That's that's how
yeah,
we have to think.
yeah. We have to start moving away because Canada loves to do stuff differently. I mean, it's almost a pride issue. It's nonsense, right? Yes, there's learning required on both sides. So, if the Canadians happen to have something that's better, let's do that.
Right.
But let's not have it different just because we're on the other side of a border. That's my
Well,
point.
I've experienced this an American up there several times. Canadians think in terms of if it's not invented here, it's not worthy of our review and acceptance. And that's how
Right.
they view things. And it's embedded in our society in Canada. I'm a Canadian citizen too, so
Well, that's a
I've
problem. In
experienced
my
it.
in my opinion, that's a problem.
Yeah,
I mean, that breaks down the rules of nationality as far as I'm concerned, but that's another matter.
right,
I mean, if you
right.
were in a trade bloc, it wouldn't matter. You could be a U.S. citizen working in Canada. Who cares? You don't have to
Yeah.
become a Canadian citizen.
But I did it to for to
I know.
take
I mean,
advantage of it because we didn't have a North American
I got
approach.
that. I got that. But
So
it's not so much you. You're a bad example. But you got people living in the Middle East that are Canadian citizens, and then when
right,
there's a bloody war there, they want a free ride back home,
yes,
so-called to Canada, even
yeah,
though they've been living there for 20 freaking years.
yeah,
What's that? What's that
and,
about?
and send aid over to their home country, right?
Right, right.
Yeah,
And you've got people living in Canada who send home money to their relatives in another country.
right.
Hmm.
That affects our current accounts balance.
I don't know. I don't know
Well,
what
it
that is.
does. It
Yeah, but I
does.
mean, it's heartbreaking to think about the impact of that. But that's it's about capital movement, right?
Right.
So anyway, they
More
are the
increase.
cultural details that we need to iron out.
Yep.
And then let's focus on um, prosperity only, mostly. Let's make sure
Right.
prosperity is the grabber. If you aren't prosperous, all these other cultural, you know, religious things don't make any sense.
Right.
You can only have opinions, and in my opinion, you can only have opinions and rights to do different things because you're prosperous. I
May I make a quick observation?
mm,
Because we've let our prosperity go in Canada and our resource extraction strategy go in Canada, it's made us weaker in terms of negotiating from a position of strength with the United States. That's
Absolutely.
given us a real problem. That we have to overcome by actually digging ourselves out of this situation. And that can only happen if we start making our own products and extracting our own material wealth in a massive way to gain uh, leverage over the United States.
Well, I'd
I
say you got
just
the
thought I'd
same problem. I
mention.
don't think it's peculiar to Canada. I'm sure, there's
Yeah,
parts of the U.S. that have suffered the same way and believe that they're, inconvenienced by prosperity. So prosperity inconvenience, if you will, is a huge matter. If we assume people can be prosperous if they go to work every day,
right,
and there is a job to go to, um, and they behave at the job, then you can, when you finish work, you can decide if you want to create a secret society off. I don't, you know, I don't want it to become a government thing. I would rather, as long as you don't actually break any laws, you should be able to do what you want outside of your working hours,
right,
right? But that's
exactly,
not what's happening. We're controlling uh, a lot of the personal decisions people make, and that I guess I'd make a really good Republican, but but that's what's happening is we the countries, the nations are almost invading the bedrooms of the citizens, right?
right,
And they
yeah,
mustn't do that. They only need to worry about the dollars they make, and
right,
that's what I meant by prosperity only. So let's forget the crazy DEI woke nonsense. That,
okay.
quite frankly, you're dead right. That's been infiltrated into the microcosms of our society by the UN and WEF. And the universities have grabbed it as a thing to do. And they've made that their internal policies to follow the UN rules and the UN edicts. Um, and quite a lot of splinter groups, favor all the things said at the WEF, including our media. So,
So if we create policies at the national and provincial level, and the cities are violating those policies because it's outside influence, then we have leverage over straightening that whole mess out, right?
right. Well, it's
Okay,
happening. I mean, Trump keeps saying democratic cities. I mean, he's saying democratic cities, but what he's saying is they're not following the rules of the federal society.
right,
That's what he's saying, and that's we've allowed globalization into the bedroom, if you will. I'm
right.
using the bedroom, but what I mean is the innerness of our society, and we're doing it in our classrooms. And that's the point, right? We're not talking about nation. We're saying things to our children like, well, you're white and you're, um, you're um, a colonialism is
Yeah,
showing. I mean, that's not nationalism.
right,
Come on. So I mean, this is the stuff that's like a corrosive activity in our society.
right,
If you want a society like that, fine, carry on. But
right.
I
We
don't think
should
it's I don't think it's working.
no, and ideology should not be in the classroom. We should keep that out of the classroom and concentrating on those skills, knowledge, skills, and abilities that our students need to be prosperous going out into the world. And
Unfortunately,
we're not
right.
doing that.
No,
We're not doing
we're
that.
we're letting them take basket weaving classes instead of, engineering classes. I'm being extreme in my thinking in
Right,
my statement, but almost. I mean, it's study this and study, expert in freaking, climate change for queers. I mean, that's you can get a degree in that now, I understand. But I mean, that's the kind of weird it is. I mean, we allowed our children
yeah,
to do everything they can not to be prosperous.
right,
And that's not cool. It's not how I was brought up. It's not how you were brought up. And
no,
in one lifetime, we've destroyed our Western culture.
right,
That's what I meant when I say forget the crazy left-leaning DI and woke nonsense. And it's being pushed by these global entities of the UN and W. There are some very good authors now pushing back on that and explaining why we're wrong to proceed on that.
right,
Um, they're not getting it totally right. And again, they're not explaining it quite the right way for people to grasp it, but it's true. Now, the average person doesn't think about it, but it's in their face. They just don't
right,
bother looking at it.
right,
So unfortunately, it's not. It's subliminal enough that people accept it,
right,
but what they aren't accepting is the outcome, which is low prosperity.
right,
So unfortunately, the best toolkit to make people aware is prosperity. It's if they'll not worry about climate change, they'll not worry about DEI and all that stuff if they aren't getting food on the table.
right.
And that's what's happening in a lot of
Well, Canadians especially, they've lost their work-life balance they once had, which was is self-understood. It was understood, and we worked hard, and we prospered, we were prosperous, and then we went off into the wilderness, and we enjoyed the Canadian uh, environment. And our kids grew up in an atmosphere where they played in that environment. They weren't worried about any of the world situations until they got into the high school and so forth. And I think I think we lost a lot of that. We lost our Canadian culture to all this interference in our life, the lives we live today, and 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 don't have the discretionary income or the the approach to life we once had, where we could have our own home and we could
yeah, all
create
those
our own lives in our communities, and our communities were really rock solid in how we approached working together. That's been
yeah, there's
lost.
there's 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 it's become harder to be a young person. Okay.
Yes,
I mean, it's become less visionary, less easy to build a goal.
right.
Um, I also think there's a certain, I mean, we were much more socialized when we were young. What I mean
Yeah,
by that was we had, if we didn't have mandatory national service in the military, we had plenty of opportunities to play that game on a voluntary basis.
right,
And so we were much more socialized as a national entity, as part of the nation. Now the kids don't have any identity at all with the
right.
nation. They
Yeah,
just happen to live there. In fact, the more that we allow immigrants into the country that don't sign up to be citizens, the more their children will be that way. And they'll start worrying about what's happening in the old country and fighting their war for them on our turf, which is exactly what's happening.
yeah,
So I would reinstall national service actually. I mean I would take I would start it at 16, um, not 18, and it would be a way of them becoming nationalized.
right.
But that's hard. Oh, you can't do that. That's fascism, right? Um, but that's exactly what it means. If we went to war right now, we had to. Of course, the war won't be the same. Won't need people. We'd be done with drones. But if we went to war right now, we wouldn't be ready for it. Our youth wouldn't.
No.
I mean,
Right.
the competition would decide if they were going to have sex with them before they'd fight with each other.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be pretty. Um, I think stopping the minority politics, where and this is my point too, is we our politics tend to focus on minority rule rather than majority rule. And so we're more interested in giving our rights as citizens away to the indigenous population and, sectors of the population that think they've got a right to do that, which is like the French situation. So we don't look at the majority rule. What's good for the majority in this country? We don't. We look at incremental vote capability, right? So that's got to stop. I mean, that's why we've got so much dichotomy and division and difficulty with getting anything done because we're always worried about the minority, you know, somebody that is, not in my backyard, not on my watch, that kind of stuff. I've got a voice, even though I'm one in 100, and if I'm not listened to and my action's not taken, it's not democracy. Well, that's not true. It's the majority rules democracy, not minorities. We got it backwards.
Yeah.
So we got to get back to majority-driven democracy. Won't be pretty, be some upset people, but that's the way it should not be done.
Hmm.
And that's where we are. So a lot of the stuff on this list, it is cultural. It is about nationalism, and it's about making everybody more prosperous. And that's what Trump's trying to do. And he's not well. And I agree with his policies. He's reading ahead, but he's not bringing people with him with his tactics and with his speech. He's right. You know, he he when he talks, it when you know what I know, it works.
Right.
When you got a bunch of people in front of you that are feeling the pain of the alternative, it works.
Right.
But when you've got people that don't have any of those things in front of them, they lose it. They just don't
Right.
get it.
Right.
Um, and you've had people brought up, as you said earlier, in a very easy life society. The affluence has done us down. We become soft, um, and we've stopped worrying about rights as citizens and worry about everybody. We tend to worry about everybody else on the planet, not ourselves.
Right.
And that's when you do when you're affluent. Oh, well, I'm fine. What about everybody else? We all do it. It's human. It's a great thing to feel. You have this virtuousness that you gain that virtual spirit, that a feeling of virtuousness when you help other people that really don't deserve it
Right.
and haven't earned it. And it does take away from what you should be focused on, which is the people next door to you.